I read this paper yesterday and I found it kind of confusing and not really convincing. Do conservatives really have better mental well-being than liberals? If you survey people and ask them about their mental health, then people who identify as conservatives are more likely to say their mental health is very good or excellent. When respondents were asked to assess their own mental health, conservatives were almost 11 points more likely to respond excellent or very good compared to liberals. Conservatives were 12 points less likely to select fair or poor when compared to liberals. But the authors are skeptical that there's a real mental health divide. They write, quote, "One explanation is rather than a genuine mental health divide, conservatives may inflate their mental health ratings when asked due to stigma surrounding the term." In other words, maybe it's not really the case that conservatives have better mental health. Maybe conservatives are just afraid or unwilling to acknowledge their own mental health problems, and so they seem to have better mental health on a survey. To investigate, they asked 500 respondents about mental health, and then another 500 respondents about their mood. Quote, "When respondents were asked to assess their overall mood, the gap between liberals and conservatives disappeared. Conservatives were actually somewhat less likely than liberals to provide a highly positive rating of their overall mood, though this difference was not statistically significant, and the gap between conservatives and liberals on selecting fair or poor overall mood was nearly zero." The authors conclude, quote, "Ultimately, the results from our experiment suggest that using different measures of well-being may lead to different conclusions about whether or not conservatives are truly happier than liberals. The story surrounding whether or not the happiness gap exists may depend on which term you use as a proxy for happiness." So this is why I said I found the whole paper kind of confusing, because there seem to be three different concepts involved here. Mental health, which is different from mood, which is different from happiness. And to investigate the happiness gap, the authors are asking about mental health and mood, and not happiness. And in general, I'm confused that the authors seem surprised that there's a difference in the mood and mental health distributions. So if the questions say, would you say that in general your overall mood is whatever, excellent to poor? Well, you might say, hey, I'm an average person. My mood is average. My mood is fine. I have no severe mental health problems, so my mental health is excellent or very good. I have no problems. And I feel like that would create the kind of distribution you see here in light blue for mental health with conservatives. Conservatives very likely to say they have excellent or very good mental health, less likely to say they have fair or poor. And mood in the, I don't know what color this is, gold? Mood is kind of centered in the middle. Most people saying they have very good or good mood. The liberal mental health distribution seems to be similar, just with a little fewer people with excellent or very good mental health and a little more people with fair or poor mental health. Moderates are kind of confusing in the sense that they seem to have a normal distribution for both mental health and mood that's kind of centered in the average, very good to good range. And that's different from conservatives and liberals, who both have the behavior where there are people who report excellent mental health and average mood. The paper says only conservatives give significantly different responses when prompted with the mental health terminology compared to overall mood. But I don't really see that looking at these graphs. It seems like conservatives and liberals have the same kind of distribution, for mental health, and then a normal distribution for mood. And it seems like moderates are distinct, having a normal distribution for both mental health and mood. In study number 1, they're using a larger sample size. This is using a survey of 60,000 American adults, but it only asks about mental health, not mood. Study 2 uses the smaller sample set of 500 asked about mental health, 500 asked about mood. But anyway, we're talking about study 1 now. They say moving the full length of the ideological scale from very liberal to very conservative is associated with about a 19-point increase in reporting positive mental health. And then they're going to control for a bunch of different factors. And they say once we account for the wide range of other factors, the gap is reduced to 11 percentage points. I was curious, why don't they make this same comparison, very liberal to very conservative, in study number 2 when they're looking at mood? Luckily, they share their data, so we can figure that out. One is people who identify as very liberal, middle, somewhat conservative, very conservative, and then these are the not sure people. But anyway, and the y-axis is percentage of people responding excellent, very good, good, fair, poor. So what you can see, we're looking at the difference between 1 and 5, very liberal, very conservative. What you can see is like very conservative people are actually more inclined to report higher moods. And maybe this distribution is changed by the inclusion of just somewhat conservative people who are less likely to report the excellent. I don't know, I guess there's a lot to say about this graph. I think the key takeaway is that very conservatives seem to have lower percentages in fair and poor mood compared to very liberal. But I noticed they didn't do that in study 2. They combined all conservatives and all liberals. But I wanted to talk about study 1 and why it's not that meaningful to me. So they say, okay, if you go from very liberal to very conservative, that's a 19-point increase in positive mental health. But once we control for a bunch of things, it's just an 11 percentage point increase in mental health. So okay, that's still a big difference in mental health, but also it just doesn't make much sense to control for a bunch of things to me. And it's just never that convincing to me when authors say we have this apparent effect and then we controlled for a dozen things and the effect was attenuated. Because in order to do statistical controls, you have to understand the causal relationship between things and you have to explain why your controls are justified. So for example, they're controlling for vaccinated for COVID-19, which they say is negatively associated with mental health. Get RFK on the line. Whoop, whoop. If you just control for a bunch of random things, you're more likely to be confusing the results of your statistical analysis than you are saying anything meaningful. So do conservatives really have better mental well-being? Yeah, probably, I guess. This paper doesn't change my mind a lot, or it doesn't make me think anything differently, really. It just makes me somewhat confused. It depends how you define conservative, and it depends how you define mental well-being. But there are meaningful constructions of these where, yeah, they have better mental health, which I think is what previous literature showed. So thanks for your time.